engines don't shunt. It was the day after Rebecca's incident with the flying kipper, and Gordon, Henry and James were planning something for her.
"When shall we do it?"
asked James.
"This evening would be best,"
replied Gordon.
"As for the rest of the day, we go about as business as usual. Is that understood?"
"Got it."
"Understood,"
replied Henry and James.
"Good. Oh, here comes our drivers. Remember, business as usual."
Later, Gordon arrived at the station for his morning express run. He was waiting impatiently for his coaches.
"Oh, come now, Percy,"
he huffed.
"If my coaches aren't here this instant, the express will be late."
Percy rolled his eyes in annoyance as he came with the coaches. "You know, Gordon, if you're really in that big of a hurry, why don't you just collect the coaches yourself? That way," he added cheekily, "you can spare us all the fuss." Gordon snorted indignantly as Percy shunted the coaches onto him.
"It would do you well to remember, little Percy, that tender engines like me are too big to shunt. We are likely to derail if we went backwards."
"True," Thomas put in cheekily. "But that's only if you're pulling a train backwards, which I seem to recall you doing once." "We remember that too," laughed Annie. "And some children thought that you were a new tank engine," chuckled Clarabelle. Everyone laughed as Gordon loudly let off steam.
"That wasn't my fault,"
he blustered.
It was the silly wind. And anyway, that's beside the point. We tender engines are not only too big for such menial work, we also have a position to maintain. As prime examples of efficiency, splendour and prestige on the railway, we cannot allow ourselves to be brought down to a lowly standard like shunting or fetching our own coaches. That's beneath us,"
he concluded grandly. "Well, it doesn't seem to be beneath Rebecca to do her fair share," Percy pointed out. "She's collecting her coaches right now."
"What?"
exclaimed Gordon. "Well, see for yourself, why don't you?" laughed Thomas. And sure enough, Gordon could see Rebecca slowly backing down onto some coaches in the yard. Her fireman coupled her on, and she pulled them out as she carefully made her way towards the platforms. Gordon was so absorbed and dumbfounded by the sight that he almost didn't hear the guard's whistle telling him it was time to go. As Rebecca backed in, she could hear Gordon grumbling indignantly as he left with the express. "What was all that about?" she asked. "Not much. Just Gordon making a fuss as usual," replied Percy as he went to arrange another train. "A fuss about what?" "How tender engines like him are too big and important to shunt and fetch their own coaches," added Thomas. "But I shunt and fetch my coaches every day," Rebecca replied. "What's wrong with that?" "Nothing at all," answered Percy. "Gordon just thinks it's beneath tender engines to do such work. He also says it's an embarrassment to the railway." "An embarrassment? Oh dear. I didn't do something wrong again, did I?" "Of course not, Rebecca," assured Thomas as his guard's whistle sounded. "You were just being really useful like any other engine, and don't let anybody like Gordon tell you different. And for that matter, you might want to keep your distance from him," added Annie as Thomas began to pull out of the station. "He was pretty steamed up by watching you, and he might give you trouble for it," called Clarabelle as she left the platform. "I'll try," replied Rebecca, and then added quietly, "I hope." And for the most part, she did. All day long, she had no confrontations with Gordon and was making good time with her runs. But unfortunately, her luck was soon run out. That evening, despite running to the correct timetable, Rebecca somehow managed to return to Timmer's sheds before the other engines. Or so she thought. When she arrived, she saw that Henry was not only in front of her berth, but he, Gordon, and James were blocking her from entering and glaring at her. Rebecca began to shake a little from the intimidation. I say, what's going on? What's going on is that you are making us look bad, snorted James. What did I do?
Well, for starters,
began Gordon.
You think you can come here and just replace me on the one job I've done for decades? You made me look bad at Vickerstown. And you ruined the Flying Kipper and started trouble with Sir Topham Hatt,
added Henry.
Henry told us last night that you did the job of a common tank engine by collecting your own coaches,
said Gordon.
I almost didn't believe it until I saw you this morning.
Rebecca then realised what was happening and immediately tried to put on a brave face. And why shouldn't I? She said as bravely. If someone else is busy, what's the harm in me wanting to help lighten up the load a little by fetching my coaches?
The harm, as you so lightly put it,
sneered Gordon,
is that it'll give the railway a bad name. We tender engines are the ones that people see first, and therefore expect us to maintain a respectable position. But to see us shunt like little tank engines, that would be disgraceful.
James and Henry snorted in agreement. Well, maybe to you three, retorted Rebecca. But what's to stop me from doing it again?
You can find another shed to sleep in until you come to your senses. And, if it keeps up, another railway.
Rebecca let off steam in shock. What? But you can't do that, she fluttered.
We can and we will,
said James.
Unless you accept your position as a responsible and reliable tender engine of our railway. You are not to be seen here.
Rebecca tried to protest, but the three engines reached her fiercely, forcing her away. She puffed away as sadly and as quickly as she could, so that Gordon, Henry, and James couldn't see her tears. Early the next morning, as Percy was returning his mail vans to Knapford, he got quite a surprise when he saw Rebecca sitting in the sheds. Rebecca, what are you doing here? Percy asked. The bigger engine said that you made a run to Vickerstown last night, and that you wouldn't be back until tonight. No, I didn't, sighed Rebecca, and she told Percy all that had happened. Percy wished indignantly. The nerves of those three, he spluttered. They obviously haven't learnt their lesson from last time. What happened last time? They decided to go on strike when the railway was busier than ever, Percy explained. It's the whole reason I came here. Shortly after I arrived, Sir Topham Hatt left them in the sheds as punishment. Do you think he'll do that again? Rebecca asked. I wish. But things are much busier now than they were then. However, he added with a sly grin, I do have an idea. Later that morning at the station, Gordon was losing patience. He'd been waiting for some time, but no one had shunted his coaches.
Where's that Percy?
He roared.
The express is going to be late.
Another 10 passed, and now the express was 5 minutes late. The passengers began to grumble. What's the hold up? Shouted one of the passengers.
Where are the coaches?
Shouted another.
We're trying,
explained Gordon's driver. He then climbed from the cab and walked over to Gordon.
Show a wheel, Gordon. We've got a job to do. I'm an express engine. My job is to pull the coaches, not fetch them. Leave it to one of the tank engines. Express engine or not, you're going to have to do it. The passengers are starting to say this is a bad railway and will most likely take the bus if you keep this up. If that's what they wish, then what, Gordon?
Boomed a familiar voice.
Do you really think that giving our business to the buses is worth your selfish dignity?
The big blue engine trembled when he saw Sir Topham Hatt glaring at him.
No, sir. But it's not my fault. Percy didn't. I'm not interested in your excuses, Gordon. We'll talk about this later, because I'm more interested in you collecting your coaches right now and getting these people to their destinations. You're late enough as it is. Yes, sir. Sorry, sir.
Gordon clanked meekly away. That evening, Sir Topham Hatt confronted Percy about the morning's disruption.
I only did it to teach Gordon not to be so rude to Rebecca, sir,
he spluttered.
I didn't mean to cause so much trouble, sir. I understand about wanting to help your friend, Percy, but making the express late to make your point is not acceptable. Both you and Rebecca should have talked to me first, instead of acting out on your own.
Yes, sir. Sorry, sir, replied the two engines.
And as for you three,
he thundered at the three big engines.
Must we really go through this nonsense again? You know better. No matter what type of engine you think you are, I expect all my engines to do the work that they are given, shunting included.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir,
sulked the three big engines.
And what's worse,
Sir Topham Hatt continued,
you tried to enforce your ideas onto Rebecca and then kicked her out when she wouldn't comply. Those are actions I most certainly do not approve of. As punishment until further notice, Henry, you will be confined to Knapford Yard with shunting duties. Same with you, James. And you, Gordon, will be strictly pulling goods trains. Goods trains? But, what about my express? I think you'll find that Rebecca will be very capable of handling it on her own,
replied Sir Topham Hatt. Then he turned to the big yellow engine.
I trust that the responsibilities of being my main express engine won't be too hard for you during Gordon's, absence?
Oh no, sir. Thank you, sir, Rebecca bubbled.
That's a good engine,
beamed Sir Topham Hatt.
Now, away with you, Henry. You're in Rebecca's berth.
After Henry slunk away, Sir Topham Hatt wished the other engines good night and left. Rebecca sighed in relief, feeling very glad to not only be back home, but very lucky to have such a good friend in Percy.